This is our last skill builder photo, and it's going to go through a couple new things, and then we'll apply some color changes to it as well. So first thing I want you to do is you're going to be able to see a different way to do essentially a clone stamp. It doesn't always work, but it's really efficient and great if it does work. So remember that this is a destructive edit. So first thing we need to do is duplicate our background layer, which is going to be Control J. And on here, we're actually going to do two things. We're going to do what's called content fill, and we're going to do a dodge and burn. That's pretty long to fit in here, but it fit most of it. All right, so what's cool about what I'm going to show you next is we've used the clone stamp and we've worked hard to like take things away. And the clone stamp is great in small little areas. Doesn't always get everything we need, and sometimes there's just an easier way. So I'm going to show you the content aware fill is what it's called. And what we're going to do is come just with your regular lasso. So this is the one where you're just drawing. So we're going to click on that. And then we're going to click and circle around. We're going to get rid of this little scar here. We're going to circle it. I had to do that and be very steady. If that's too hard, you can try like the quick selection or object select. It's just usually is helpful if you select kind of a little bit of the area around whatever you're going to do the content aware fill with. So now that we have that, we're going to go up to edit fill, and we are going to go down to content aware, and you can keep everything else the same and say okay. We'll give it a moment to actually do this. And oops, I clicked on the magic wand, so it selected a different area. But look at that. Like, it's pretty much gone. Control D to take your selection on. That looks pretty good in overall. In Photoshop, I think it looks even better. This is Photo P right now. And then if you wanted to come in, you could like clean it up even more. So we could come in with just the clone tool, do our alt click. So I could like just clean up those edges just a little bit, do an alt click. Oh, I would need to soften my brush quite a bit to get it to blend. So softer brush, the more it's going to blend. Make my brush bigger with the bracket key. And then I could blend some of those edges if they seem just a little bit off. Okay. So that's how the content aware fill works. I highly recommend that you use it, but you'll also have to use the clone stamp in some spaces as well. All right, the last thing that I'm going to show you on here is dodge and burn. And dodge and burn they're both tools. They work in a similar way, but they do different things. So if you're in Photo P, you're probably going to see this drop. This is the blur tool, and if you click and hold, there's dodge and burn. I'm going to start with the burn tool. We'll start with the burn tool. And if you're in Photoshop, you'll look for, once again, the hand or this circle with the line coming out. All right, so the purpose of the dodge and burn is to lighten or darken different areas depending on if it's where it is. So like we've used selection tools to lighten or darken certain areas, but now we can do this with essentially a paintbrush. So we don't have to come in and do a selection and adjustment. We can just paint on certain areas to make it look lighter or darker. So once again, we're using a brush. So bracket key, left and right bracket key to the next to the letter P to make your brush bigger and smaller. Definitely bring down the hardness on this. So I would start at like 40-ish% approximately. You can always change that later. And then in your options bar with the range, you can see that you've got highlights, midtones, shadows. We're going to start and we're going to analyze our picture to decide if we're working in which area of those we're working in. Exposure we'll come back to later. I'll show you how that works. So with the burn tool, we want to think about any areas we want to darken. So if we look at this picture overall, I want you to think to yourself for a moment, like what area looks too bright that should really be darkened. And you can think about, anything that stands out, or if you want to add like a certain aesthetic, artistic feel, you could just darken some areas that way. So when I first look at this beard, it's so white that it looks really white initially, almost too light. So we're gonna just darken the beard here. We can also try and darken this highlight a tiny bit. It's good to have bright whites, but once we start to lose the detail, it's just a little too bright. Now, initially, since we're going to be working in the highlight area, we would probably want to go to highlights in our range. Now, something that's just kind of weird about this is sometimes when you work in highlights with the burn, it actually makes it look gray, and that's not what we want. So let me show you. If I go to highlights, you can see it's just making it look gray, which is not what we're trying to do. If we bring down our exposure, it's going to be not as strong. So I'm at 19. So it's not as dark, but it's still like makes it look gray. We just want it to not be so bright, but we don't want it to look gray. So one trick if you're working in highlights and you're burning them to make them darker is just to go to your shadows. I would keep your range about 20 to 25%. And then what we can do is come in and we can darken this just a little bit. And that looks pretty good overall. I'm going to step back in my history. And it was a little bit darker than I want. So I'm going to bring my exposure down. I'm going to try it at like 16%. And just a few little clicks will start to bring out some of the mid-tones in that area, which will give the illusion that it's darker and we can see more of the texture come out. Okay, so this is with my change without the content aware and the burn, and this is with, so just a little bit darker. We could try the same thing up here. This time I'm going to increase my exposure a little bit, so it's a little bit of a back and forth, and then we can darken some areas just a little bit. So I'm just clicking a few times, so just be careful with this. Don't overdo it because it's really obvious if you do. All right, so burn is darken. I could even come in if I wanted to, like in the shadow area in the background, I could come in and, maybe darken that just a little bit more. I could come in with a selection tool. That could work really well. Or I could just brush really quickly. Ooh, that's too dark. Bring my exposure down. And I could just bring in just a little bit darker area and make him pop out more. Okay, that would be an option of what you could take, but a different way to use it. Now, our dodge tool is going to lighten. So if we look at certain parts of this picture that we could kind of lighten up, the face is really in shadow. So that would be my first spot to just lighten up just a little bit. We want this to be subtle. So when we click and hold on the dodge tool this time, because we're going to lighten, same thing. We've got highlights, midtone, shadows, and we've got exposure. 50% is pretty intense. So let's bring that down to 25 to start. And then we are in a shadow area. I don't know if shadows will be too dark. Sometimes this is a little experimental. But we'll start with shadows. Go ahead and change that brush edge. Bring that hardness down quite a bit, maybe 25% as well. And then just click. Ooh, that's okay. So let me tell you what's happening. Yes, that is lightening up these areas, but it's almost making it too light, like we're losing the shadows. It looks gray and flat. So not what we want. So once again, go back. Let's work in the midtones. So midtone should keep some of those dark shadows in there so it still has contrast, but in some areas it'll lighten it up just a little bit so we can see his eyes a little bit more. So we can choose, a few areas to lighten up. You don't have to do a lot with it. It just should be subtle, just like that. So that's great for the dodge and burn.